Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar on how to mitigate emerging security threats from third parties, presented by Process Unity and Cybersecurity Insiders. I'm Holger Schulze, the founder of Cybersecurity Insiders, a community that proudly serves over 600,000 cybersecurity professionals, and I'll be your moderator today. Today's webinar is brought to you by Process Unity, an industry-leading third-party risk management platform. The Process Unity TPRM platform combines powerful workflow, a universal data core, the world's largest global risk exchange, and AI-powered teams to modernize your third-party risk management program. Now, before we begin, let me share some quick housekeeping items. If you have any questions during the webinar, please use the questions window in your GoToWebinar control panel. We'll address your questions during the Q&A session at the end of today's presentation. Additional materials about the Process Unity TPRM platform are available for download in the handout section, including an e-guide on the key metrics to optimize your third-party risk. So make sure to go there and download the PDFs. Finally, this webinar is being recorded for your reference, and we will make the recording available shortly after the event. All right, let's get started as we dive into third-party risk management and how it helps to identify and mitigate risks from external vendors to protect an organization's security and compliance. And with that said, now it is my pleasure to introduce today's expert presenter for this deep dive into TPRM. Please welcome Gary Phipps, and Gary is Vice President of Strategy at Process Unity. Welcome, Gary. Thank you for presenting today.
Thanks for having me, Holger. I'm really excited about this content specifically and helping organizations figure out how to address those application vulnerabilities and threat actors that are emerging and creating more exposure for their extended ecosystem.
Excellent. That's a very interesting and also very timely topic. And on that, Gary, can you tell us more about third-party risk management and what we will learn in today's webinar?
Sure, Holger. Let me cover my agenda real quick and let the audience know how we'll be spending our time together today. The first thing I want to really address are what are the business challenges that organizations have to overcome in order to be able to identify emerging threats and manage them effectively. I also want to talk a little bit about, in an ideal world, what do we hear from our customers and our clients about what they're trying to achieve? And so I think this is really all about prioritizing the work that follows any particular emerging threat publication. So I'll talk about smart prioritization, as I call it. Then I'll wrap up with a quick demonstration, just a few minutes on, what that prioritization process might look like that we cover, during the slides themselves.
Thank you, Gary. Now, can you elaborate on the specific challenges, right, that companies encounter when responding to emerging threats within their third-party ecosystem, and how threat response solutions should address those challenges?
Absolutely. So when I think about these emerging threats, I'm kind of taken back to the Apache Log4j event, and I've got this mental illustration in my head of an executive sitting at a red light in a vehicle looking at his LinkedIn app on his cell phone, and he reads something that there's a significant alarm, and then all of a sudden he or she reaches out and starts calling a bunch of people at their company and basically saying, what are we doing about this? Are we impacted? So on and so forth. And so that's a mental illustration I have in my head when I start to develop a business case around emerging threats. Obviously, Apache Log4j was certainly not the first emerging threat that's occurred, but it's the one that had the biggest impact and has most recently, kind of timely, that set off this kind of new, approach to addressing these particular issues. The challenges that organizations have to overcome in order to effectively address emerging threats are quite a few, but I'll talk about the top ones here. Organizations are receiving a lot of alerts coming from their different systems and the different security communities that they're subscribed to. And most organizations, according to Ponyman, for example, are only able to address around 4% of those particular alerts. It's incredibly difficult to take care of every single one of them. It's hard to separate the signal from the noise, if you would. And it's primarily because, one, it's confusing, and number two, they just don't have the resources to be able to address every single one of these particular alerts and notifications. The second issue that organizations have, and probably more importantly, is that they have very limited visibility into their entire third-party portfolio. And even more important is, of that third-party portfolio, is what's the technology footprint that each of these third parties are associated with. And so if I have a bad starting point for this analysis and this response, you almost wonder if you're, if you're not starting with the full picture in mind, what's the value of the remainder of the analysis? And while I'm a big proponent of not letting perfection get in the way of progress, you really need to make sure that you're starting with the big picture. The third piece here is that we have a tendency to use the same type of like due diligence, self-assessment type onboarding questionnaires as the same tool for every single job. It's kind of like the flathead screwdriver that's in the junk drawer in my kitchen. It gets used for nearly everything except for driving flathead screws. And so we see a lot of delays when we send these out, and we're hitting our third parties who are in the middle of crisis at a bad time to be able to throw out 1,000-question questionnaire. The biggest challenge here, or maybe it's a latent pain, is the business stakeholders' loss of confidence in our program's capability and overall value. And that's hard to get back once it's actually lost. They lose that confidence because we're unable to respond quickly and effectively to these particular threats. So think back to that, executive sitting at the red light, staring at the LinkedIn app on the phone, reading about some new, advanced persistent threat actor that is targeting, some industry. When they're making that phone call, they're expecting the person on the other end of that line to be as responsive as, they are that, made them make that call at a red light. And so in an ideal world, we would have full visibility of our entire third-party portfolio. So we'd start by, taking all third parties that, we paid in the last 3 years and deduping those payments and putting those third parties into a single platform to where we could, continuously monitor them for susceptibility to these emerging threats. Instead of getting every single alert, we would have parameterized and event-based alerts that draw our attention to those things that are most important. So, I don't want the full fire hose. I just want those things that are, the part of the alerts that are titrated such that I'm only getting those that are high severity, high impact, high susceptibility, and things to that effect. We would be able to take that information and then prioritize which third parties would require further follow-on action in a very smart way, which I'll get to in just a second. And then finally, we would be able to do these things all very quickly. The value of any organization's response capability to emerging threats will be measured in speed. And so it's all about making sure that you're able to turn back to that executive and say, I know what the size of the problem is, and here's my plan to address it. And so I think that this, at least in one way, sums up what the challenges are in the ideal state. And I'd like to start talking a little bit more about this kind of concept of smart prioritization. And so not only is the, one of the primary success metrics of the response capability speed, your ability to act effectively will also be determined by your capability to prioritize your entire third-party portfolio to determine where next follow-on action is actually required. This is important because any organization, even the largest, most sophisticated third-party risk programs, will never have the amount of resources it would require to go perform analysis and follow up with every single third party in their portfolio. One, it's just not necessary, but even if it were, you're just not going to have enough resources to do so. So you have to take a, very tired phrase here, but you do have to take a risk-based approach. And so what I'm proposing for consideration is that you identify those priority third parties using this concept of overlapping risk factors or risk attributes, if you would. So when a new threat emerges and I'm trying to prioritize my portfolio, I can ask myself some pretty binary questions at the beginning. One, I can say, what part of my population of my third parties, if they were susceptible to this emerging threat, do I just frankly not care, right? While I would prefer that none of my third parties are ending up being impacted by this emerging threat, I have to focus on those third parties that actually have access to the assets that are either being targeted or could be impacted by this emerging threat. And so the first thing I want to do is to identify what my critical vendor population is, or the subpopulation, if you would. So if I think of inherent risk as being the identifier here, I can either use a 5-level inherent risk ranking, or even just high, medium, and low. And so I want to focus on my high inherent risk third parties, because those are the ones that have access to those assets that I've entrusted to that are implicated in this threat. The second thing that I want to be able to do is I want to understand the threat itself and determine which defensive countermeasures or controls need to be in place in order to block the exploitation, if you would. And then I would be able to, if I know what those controls are, I can look at whatever data I have available from due diligence or continuous monitoring or ongoing periodic reassessment, and identify which third parties have deficiencies in those control areas. And so now I've got, an even smaller population. Then in the way of application vulnerabilities, if I have the capability to identify third parties that are users of the vulnerable application, well, that would certainly help. And now, I've got a even smaller population. So high-risk third parties that are deficient of required controls that are users of the vulnerable application. And then finally, a lot of our threat actors these days have very specific pedigree or type of victimology. And so if, for example, there is a specific geographical region that is being targeted, such as the war in Ukraine, or if there is a specific threat actor that is targeting a certain industry, then I can include that as an additional attribute to help me prioritize. And so there's probably more of these overlapping risk attributes, but if you think of just these four, any organization that or any third party that is 4 out of 4, they're vulnerable, they're deficient, they're high risk, and they're in the targeted, particular firmographic profile, those are the ones I need to reach out first. Those that are 3 out of 4, is the next group, 2 out of 4, so on and so forth. And so this is what I mean by smart prioritization. So let's take a look at how people might determine these 4 risk attributes. So identifying inherent risk can be as simple or as complex as you would like to make it. At Process Unity, we have a auto inherent risk capability that we've employed in our platform because a lot of organizations have extremely large portfolios. I'm talking about 50 to 60,000 third parties, even after the non-cyber relevant vendors have been removed. And so these are very big companies, and the prospect of having to complete impact assessments on every single one of them can be pretty paralyzing. And so what we do is we look at the industry that the vendor's in. So starting on this table from the far left, we compile attack scenarios that have occurred in specific industries over time, and we deconstruct them and identify which defensive controls would need to be in place in order to stop all those different types of attacks. The more controls that are required, the more complex the defensive capability would be for a vendor to deploy, and as such, the more likely it is that an attack will be successful. And so we look at from a service risk perspective, we look at the type of assets that are typically entrusted to vendors in that industry. And with all that information, we're able to easily quantify, the inherent risk of a third party. And so we want to put them into one of these 3 buckets, high, medium, or low. And then if you're a little more advanced, then maybe you have a corresponding inherent risk score that goes with it. And on this slide, you'll see there's an 87, at the bottom there. So, if we're looking at healthcare, we know how many times they've been attacked, the threat volume and threat variety, which controls need to be in place. And, we count all of that up to get to this inherent risk score. So now I know which third parties are, high inherent risk across my portfolio, either using an automation or our onboarding process. How do we know what the technology footprint is of our third parties? And you really need to have a technology capability in order to do this, or a data provider. And so, as it turns out that in the course of normal business, companies will leave behind different traces of what technology they're using. And so on the table on the right-hand side of the slide here, you'll notice that we have different sources in the methodology in which the source is leveraged to obtain technology information. So the first one is web signature. And so a lot of companies, even our competitors in this space, we're all basically using the same capabilities to identify the technology footprint of a third party. Web information gathering, or using HTML type information, will tell us a lot about the technology that a company uses just in how they're maintaining their website. And so whenever 2 websites interact with one another, they transfer information, from the browser to the actual website. And it says in this handshake, it exchanges a lot of information about what they are actually using to run that website. And so, we do things like using NLP to identify certain technologies in job postings and things to that effect. So if on LinkedIn, Cybersecurity Insiders was hiring, a brand new threat intelligence subject matter expert, and specifically they want, a particular resource that has experience using things like Dark Owl or Recorded Future or CrowdStrike or things to that effect, then we pick up on those types of things. And so in email, when an email is sent, there is certain technologies identified in their email extended headers, which will also identify certain types of technology. So even process unity, we have alerts and notifications that go out to our customers to identify, certain, concerns or time-based things that they need to be aware of. And it will, self-identify where it's coming from and, the technology that is being used to submit that particular email. And so there's a lot of different ways that organizations, can approach this to identify the technology footprint of a third party.
So this is very technical, right, Gary, which is the nature of it, of course. But how do people address this for their organization and make it actionable?
Yeah, so this is probably the most complex aspect of emerging threat management. And so you're either going to need a information security operations person that has experience in website scanning, technology scanning, port scanning, things to that effect, or you're going to need a data provider that would be able to feed you this information. And so a lot of companies will subscribe to data providers like, Census or Shodan or Volners to be able to provide them this type of information. And it's pretty inexpensive to get access to this data from a data provider, provided you know exactly what you're looking for and then what to do with it as soon as you get it. So my recommendation is that organizations, if they're not, you know, experienced in port scanning and things to that effect, that they use a data provider, and it'll get them much further downfield a lot faster. And it's not, once you dig in, it's not nearly as complex as I seem to make it sound on this slide, actually, Holger.
Yeah, thank you. That makes perfect sense.
So let me talk about how it is that we identify the deficiencies that a third party must have, or that a third party could have, that would make them more susceptible to an emerging threat. To identify the control deficiencies, we first have to identify the controls. And even before that, we have to identify the techniques that a third party is using to exploit the vulnerability. And so for that, what organizations will do is they'll have either a threat intelligence team that conducts research. They'll actually look at any documentation that is being shared across the community, the information security community, that is already available on how the application vulnerability is being exploited. And so when I use the word technique, what I'm referring to is, what are the steps, the specific technical steps that are being taken to take some type of action on an objective. And so if you think about, give you a very bland analogy here, but if someone was going to break into my house, for example, there are certain steps that that actor may take in order to get to whatever it is that they were looking for, televisions or cash or whatever it is that they're trying to get from the inside of my home. And one of the first things that they may do is to try to figure out when the best time of day it is to come to my house. So they perform reconnaissance. Maybe, I don't know, for lack of a better analogy, maybe they're just trolling on Facebook waiting for me to say that I'm going on vacation. So at least they know I'm not going to be home. They may look at information to find out if I have a dog, or they may case the outside of the home to see if I have an ADT sign or things to that effect. They may try to break a window, and if there's window locks or some type of system, maybe they come into the door, or whatever the case may be. These are the steps they're going to take in order to perpetrate the malfeasance, if you would. Well, if we know what steps that they're going to take, then we can map those to things like defensive countermeasures. So number one, educate myself that I shouldn't be posting the times and dates that I'm not going to be home on Facebook and social media. Number two, I want to make sure that I have different types of theft-proof capabilities on my windows and doors, and I want to make sure that I keep anything that's inside my house that's of extreme value and in a safe and things to that effect. So those are the controls that we've identified that map to the steps that a threat actor is going to take. And so with that, we can go and then start to mine whatever security and control information we have on that third party to identify where vendors are deficient. And so a lot of that is looking at your due diligence self-assessment documentation and making sure that you have that filed away in a structured format that makes it easy for you to go in and then say, well, where are all my third parties who have access to my sensitive data, for example, that also do not have good security awareness training or do not have, you know, threat detection and intrusion prevention type capabilities. And then I'll start to understand what the subset of my population is that are deficient and therefore susceptible to the emerging threat. So how do organizations do this, right? Like, how do they know which techniques map to which particular types of controls? Well, one, you kind of have to get past the, you know, oh, this seems overwhelming, I'm never going to be able to understand this, and you really have to just dig in. And so I want to take a look at one of the specific techniques that an organization or that a threat actor may use in order to, you know, perpetrate some type of malfeasance. And the technique of the day that we're going to use is called brute force. I believe that's T1110, maybe. When a threat actor wants to use this specific technique in order to gain access to a targeted application or network, there's a lot of different ways that they can do that. But what we do here is we identify all the different controls that could be put in place in order to stop the brute force attack. And so things like, you know, we may have credential revocation controls in place. We may have one-time passwords such that they're not able to be reused. We may rotate credentials, and we may even reissue them. So there's different ways that we can, you know, put these blockers in place so that they can't move past this particular step. And so we map those things back to a control framework that we want to use. And it doesn't matter, you know, if it's NIST or if it's ISO or like whatever control framework that you are using as the standard, you will take that technique and map it back to those controls that you have assessed for the existence of during your due diligence, during your periodic reassessment, and that you've mapped to any continuous monitoring capability that you have, so that when you receive an alert that says, you know, passwords are being sold on the dark web for a particular third party, and you may make some determination that either their credential standard or their password requirements or, you know, even their access agreements and things to that effect are deficient in some way. You know, at the least they are clearly ineffective. And so that's how we map these things back to from the technique itself to those particular controls that need to be in place to block the emerging threat. And so how do we even identify what those techniques are in the first place? And so a lot of organizations may, again, have a data provider that tells them about this specifically using some type of security application. a lot of us in the information security community try to use publicly available sources so they're much more accessible to a wider population. And so, for example, the picture on the right-hand side of this slide is an advisory that has been sent out from the CISA department. CISA stands for Cybersecurity Infrastructure and Security Agency. It's part of the Department of Homeland Security. And whenever there is a vulnerability that is being exploited out there in the wild, if it is high impact and it's very widely used technology, then they'll send out an advisory that tells us exactly what the TTPs are, or the tactics, techniques, and procedures that are being used to exploit the vulnerability. And so in this example, you see I have 5 different techniques that are being strung together in order to exploit this Alpha V Black Cat type of a ransomware attack, which happened to be the threat actor that attacked the healthcare provider a couple of weeks back. And so if I can get comfortable with these advisories when they come in, and I have these techniques that are already mapped to my controls, then I can go straight to my controls database where I'm storing all of those self-assessments and start to look for third parties that are deficient in the controls that were mapped to these techniques. Just for a measure of volume, this past year, CISA sent out 43 different advisories, and not all of them, were immediately actionable, but nearly half of them did have these tactics, techniques, and procedures so that they were easily mappable back to those defensive controls. And again, as I mentioned, it really doesn't matter what control framework that you're using. We have our own CyberGRX control framework that is based on NIST. It's based on ISO, PCI, and the Center for Internet Security control frameworks. But whatever you have, just as long as you're consistent in its use, should be sufficient. The next thing I wanted to talk about, I mentioned using firmographic information where a threat actor is known for a specific victimology. And so in this CISA advisory, we even see that they're calling out that healthcare specifically is being attacked by this particular threat actor. And so if the industrial sector that your vendors are in, and you have that codified, in your data core, of information that you can report against, then you can get even more targeted. So who are my high-risk third parties that have deficient controls that are specifically in the healthcare industry? And, you can make that subpopulation even smaller. So what I'd like to do now is to hop in and just show you a quick demonstration of what this prioritization might actually look like. So I'm logging into Process Unity's active threat response solution, and where I land is just a dashboard that tells me a little bit about my third-party population, the total number of vendors in my portfolio, the distribution of high, medium, and low inherent risk. But what I'm trying to get to is vulnerabilities. And so my application is reaching out to the NIST National Vulnerability Database every single evening, and it's pulling in anything new that is high severity that's related to a particular CVE. And the one I want to look at is the Citrix NetScaler actual vulnerability. And so the information that I'm pulling in, again, I'm going directly to the source. So CISA funds the National Vulnerability Database that NIST maintains, where applicants apply for CVE IDs. CVE stands for Common Vulnerability Enumeration. And anytime an application vulnerability is identified, The applicant who identified it will reach out and apply for a CVE ID, and they'll start to identify things about that application vulnerability so that the vendor can start to address it. For, again, order of magnitude or volume, there were about 30,000 of these that were issued in the last year or two. Of those, however, CISA only introduced around 85 of them last year into its known exploited vulnerability catalog. And so that speaks to the difference between the noise and the signal, right? So a ton of these CVEs came out, but our own Department of Homeland Security, CISA agency, only identified around 85 of them being exploited in the wild, if you would. And so we always want to apply patches to our applications when they come out by our providers, but some of them require more action and investigation. And so Citrix NetScaler, the gateway code injection vulnerability is one of those, as it related to a pretty large incident in the telecommunications industry late last year. And so I have information down here that is very helpful. The CVEs can have what we call CPEs, or common platform enumerations, where it tells us specifically the vendor and the product that is implicated in this particular application vulnerability. And if you think back when we were talking about technology footprint, if I have a data provider or some internal capability that helps me identify what products and services our third parties are users of, then I can relate this vulnerability record directly with that product. And so I'm looking up Citrix NetScaler, and I've got a large list of technology footprint that is available in this list of values. This is the one I want to relate it to. By doing this, by creating a relationship from this vulnerability record to this product record, it automatically allows me to identify all third parties in my portfolio that are users of the solution. So I've got at least one of the attributes here, which is the vulnerability, the application vulnerability. I also know from the CVE information that I'm pulling in that the severity of this is high, and that the confidentiality, availability, and integrity impacts are all high. So this is definitely one that I want to be paying attention to. And so from here, I can move on to even identify the name of the threat actor if I want. And so I don't believe this was ALF-V, but they're in this drop-down list. So once I save this, I can move directly onto my context report. And this is listing all of the third parties in my portfolio who may be users of that particular product. Doesn't necessarily mean that they're deficient. It just means that they are known users of the vulnerable application. And we're not certain of the particular version that they're using, but what's important here is that I'm no longer looking at 512 third parties. I'm looking at a subset. And so from here, I want to lay on those other attributes. So maybe I'm only concerned about high risk third parties, and I'm only concerned about third parties in a specific industry. So if we were looking at that recent ALF-V Black Cat attack, maybe I just want to select my healthcare providers. I also have access to my continuous monitoring solution, and so maybe I want to select some of those risk signals. So maybe since this is application vulnerability, I'm only interested in those that have a recent impact or abuse of company infrastructure, whatever the risk rule is that I want to apply. The fourth party product I've already pulled in here, and so when I apply those filters that I kind of layer on, then I can see that I have fewer third parties that are in my list now. If I have a threat profile where I've mapped certain techniques directly to the control countermeasures, and I have a database of control deficiencies, then I can go ahead and pull in their coverage of control score. So think about this. If there were 10 controls in that threat profile that needed to be in place to stop this exploitation, then I want to take those 10 controls, add them up, divide by 10 to get a coverage score of some kind. And then that's going to pull in and create a deficiency score for my portfolio. And so now I've got my coverage scores for all of my vendors in here. And so, if I want to be able to, filter this down even further to say, well, anyone who has 85% control coverage of the controls that need to be in place to block this particular exploit, I can filter these down even further. And from here, now I want to reach out to third parties, not all 500 in my portfolio, but just these that have been prioritized, and ask them a handful of questions. One, can I confirm that my understanding of your use of the technology is correct? Are you a user of the vulnerable application? Number two, have you been impacted by this particular vulnerability that we are referring to, Citrix NetScaler Gateway code injection vulnerability? If so, has any of my data or my downstream customers' data been impacted as a result? And number four, have you applied the vendors' suggested remediations that are also identified in this short form 4-question questionnaire? And so by doing this, I've been able to prioritize all of this information down into a subset of the population, and I've taken quick follow-on action. And I'll wait for those responses to come back in. And when my executive is sitting at the red light looking at their LinkedIn app and they reach out and they say, what's the size of my problem and what are we doing about it? I can respond very, very quickly with the simple methodology applied. And so again, if we go back to the ideal state that we're trying to achieve as a result of this, we want to be able to ensure that we respond quickly. And with this short list of steps, I think we've been able to do that. Because we don't have enough resources to boil the ocean, we want to apply those, really smart risk practitioners and information security operators where they're most useful, and that's against those third parties that are most susceptible. And we also, as a result, will have the ability to put a stop to any further financial or compliance impact with this particular capability. So you can do all of those things that I mentioned there without spending a ton of money on technology. You can put together those capabilities using existing self-assessments and creating your own kind of structured data, actual database, so that you can go reach in and identify those deficiencies that are associated with those application vulnerabilities that are being exploited at the right time. Obviously, I wouldn't be speaking on this particular topic if I didn't actually represent an application that's already designed to do all of these things. And so Process Unity, that's what we're in the business of, is we are in the business of creating and helping organizations deploy programs and workflows that already have these best practices kind of wired in. We're designed by subject matter experts in our company that have decades and decades of experience in this particular space, and we do so very, very quickly. What's really important, I think, about Process Unity is that we've developed the all-in-one third-party risk management platform. And so we have process automation. Whenever we touch a piece of third-party information, we are storing it in a universal data core for you to draw on at the right time at some later date when you need it, such as when a threat emerges. We have the first and largest global risk exchange of completed assessments and AI powered analytics on that exact same data. And so Process Unity has a pre-built solution to be able to help you manage those emerging threats as they do emerge, if you would.
Thank you, Gary. That was excellent. And thank you for the deep dive into third-party risk management and the Process Unity TPRM platform. Now, before we tackle some of the audience questions that are coming in, where can people go to learn more about Process Unity and how to automate third-party risk management? Can you walk us through that real quick, Gary?
Absolutely. So you can think of this as the altar call, so to speak, and all of this information about our capabilities and our solutions to emerging threats can be found on our website. So it's processunity.com. If you want to reach out to someone, if you find, I'm a big fan of our website, but if you find it overwhelming and you have very specific targeted questions, you can reach out to the email address here on this slide, or reach out to me directly. I love talking to customers. I am a solution engineer at heart, and so I like to solve problems. So feel free to reach out to me directly, gary.phipps@processunity.com.
Thank you, Gary. Now, should we answer a few audience questions? But
Yes.
before we dive in, just a quick note to our audience. We would like to hear from you and hear what's on your mind. So if you have any questions that you'd like us to address, please type them into the questions window on your GoToWebinar control panel. And this is your chance to tap into the expertise we have here today. All right, let's take a look and see what questions are coming in. Gary, the first question, how can organizations be certain they've identified all third parties susceptible to a threat?
So I want to be super transparent here. So what we're trying to accomplish here, the focus is really that smart prioritization. Unless you're doing some borderline illegal type of scanning, it's very hard to know if you have identified everyone that is a user of the vulnerable application, or unless you're doing the things that the threat actors are doing, it's hard to know exactly all your third parties that are really susceptible, to this type of attack. And so what we're trying to do is to take all of the available information that we have access to and quickly prioritize that portfolio down to an accessible population. And so it's very difficult to know if you have identified every single one of the third parties that are susceptible, but we can certainly make a very good start at creating that prioritization. And we try to separate ourselves from the threat actors themselves. So when I was talking about the reconnaissance, by watching me on Facebook talk about the vacations I was going to take to not be home, there are certainly, ways that threat actors use to go, tease out where those particular holes are. But as I said, we separate ourselves from the use of those particular tactics themselves. And so we can never be 100% sure, but we'd certainly use all the available information at our disposal to get as close as we can.
Excellent. Thank you, Gary. The next question, MITRE ATT&CK can seem overwhelming, right, for folks that are new to information security. How do you recommend a beginner get started?
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with the sentiment as well. So before I went to CyberGRX, I was a risk practitioner at heart, and by experience, my career background, separate that a little bit from those personnel that are security kind of background and credentialed, if you would. And so as a risk practitioner trying to understand and untangle the complex world of technology and security, it did seem a little daunting to me as well. And so MITRE ATT&CK actually was a conduit that opened up a lot of this for me personally. It allowed me to approach security in a very defined type way. It gave me a methodology for doing so. And so one of the first things that I did was I went to MITRE Attack, their particular website, and they've got a couple of onboarding videos that I went through. So there's two of them primarily, and each of them are about 45 minutes long. And those two, welcome to, getting started with MITRE Attack, were incredibly foundational and made the rest of my journey through information security so much more accessible to me, because the two education videos are really spelt out very well to lay people. And so from a risk practitioner's perspective, I didn't know what a T1598 was, or T1110, or a TA00. I didn't even know what I was looking at until I went through those particular videos. Their education capability really opened up this particular world for me. And so I would recommend to anyone that's getting started in here to go further illuminate your journey by taking those two courses.
Thank you, Gary. It looks like we have time for one more question. And the question is, how should organizations approach, say, fifth and sixth parties? And where does it end?
So I hope, for the audience sake, that I am the most cynical person that they hear from today. And so my perspective on, nth parties, if you would, is that these are organizations who are not beholden to you, and as a result, they will not sustain, a mandatory control assessment. They're not you're not their customer. And so what I suggest that organizations do is they focus on the service provider and technology footprint of their third parties, and they make sure to assess their third party risk management capability. And so to do anything that's not boiling the ocean and will actually have some result, I think that if we're able to understand our third parties risk management capability in assessing, remediating, and continuously addressing deficiencies that come up in their third party ecosystem, then we've done a lot of what we can do. And then having that technology footprint information about our third parties, I think, which I guess we would call fourth party, is probably where we want to focus for the time being. I think that when we get into the very fanciful concept of concentration risk in our extended ecosystem, and unless we're talking about supply chain specifically, if you're a provider of electricity and you only have one provider of limestone or whatever it is, you may want to focus on that. But I think that we want to focus on our third parties technology footprint and their service provider footprint for the most part. And I think that those nth parties, it's a great philosophical discussion, but it's very hard to do practically because we don't have contracts with those organizations. So let's just make sure we understand what our third parties risk management capability is, and focus there, I guess, for the time being. That is my cynical, very humble opinion, if you would.
Thanks, Gary. I like it, and it's a great closing statement. Gary, thank you again for sharing your insights today on automating third-party risk management. That was excellent. Thank you.
Thanks for having me, Holger, and I appreciate the audience's attention today. And again, feel free to reach out to me or anybody at Process Unity if you want some more information on this.
And with that, we have reached the finish line of today's session. If we couldn't get to all of your questions today, don't worry. We'll be following up with you to answer your questions over the next few days. Also, please keep an eye out for a follow-up email that will include a link to the webinar recording. Thank you again for joining us today. It's been a pleasure hosting this conversation, and I sincerely hope you found this webinar as informative as I did. My name is Holger Schulze, and you've been listening to a Cybersecurity Insiders webinar. Well, I look forward to seeing all of you again at one of our future webinars. Until then, take care and have a great day.